At this point, let us discuss the concept and principles of disaster risk reduction. To open up our discussion, answer the question, why disaster risk reduction matters? The answer may be obvious. I presume you got the idea. It boils down to self-preservation. Based on statistics, more than 50% of people in developing countries are expected to be vulnerable to weather hazards by 2025. 95% of disaster fatalities occur in developing countries like the Philippines. While the 23 richest countries and the European Union invest only 2% of their annual humanitarian spending in disaster prevention and preparedness. To better understand the concept that I will be presenting to you later, I will introduce to you the key terminologies of DRR. Hazard, a dangerous phenomenon, substance, human activity, or condition that may cause loss of life, injury or other health impacts, property damage, loss of livelihood and services, social and economic disruption, or environmental damage. Capacity is a combination of all strengths and resources available within a community, society, or organization that can reduce the level of risk or effects of a disaster. Capacity may include infrastructure and physical means, institutions, societal coping abilities, as well as human knowledge, skills, and collective attributes such as social relationships, leadership, and management. Capacity may also be described as capability. Vulnerability, the characteristics and circumstances of a community, system, or asset that make it susceptible to the damaging effects of a hazard. Vulnerability may arise from various physical, social, economic, and environmental factors, such as poor design and construction of buildings, inadequate protection of assets, lack of public information and awareness, limited official recognition of risks and preparedness measures, and disregard for wise environmental management. Disaster. It is a serious disruption of the functioning of a community or a society involving widespread human, material, economic, or environmental losses and impacts, which exceeds the ability of the affected community or society to cope using its own resources. Disasters are often described as a result of the combination of the exposure to hazard, the conditions of vulnerability that are present, and insufficient capacity or measures to reduce or cope with the potential negative consequences. Disaster impacts may include loss of life, injury, disease, and other negative effects on human, physical, mental, and social well-being. Together with damage to property, destruction of assets, loss of services, social and economic disruption, and environmental degradation. Risk is defined as a combination of the probability of an event and its negative consequences. Resilience is the ability of a system, community, or society exposed to hazards to resist, absorb, accommodate, and recover from the effects of a hazard in a timely and efficient manner, including through the preservation and restoration of its essential basic structures and functions. Alright, let's keep it rolling. What do you call these events? Will you consider it as a disaster? Answer me categorically. Yes or no? Okay, let's check it. The answer is no. All these events are hazards. Take a look at these images. It is important to differentiate hazard from disaster. The phrase natural disaster, which is widely used, often causes confusion and has been the subject of debates. Strictly speaking, there are no such things as natural disasters, but there are natural hazards. So when will hazard turns into a disaster? Disaster occurs when an extreme natural event hits a vulnerable population. In other words, it is the result of a hazard's impact on society. Let us narrow down the perspective. What can you say about this picture? Is it a disaster? Not yet. Let us do some basic evaluation. In this scenario, there are 4 kids playing the rapids. That means that these individuals are exposed or present in a hazardous condition. In short, they are at risk, and risk means potential loss. That can be a loss of life. Are these kids know how to swim? If not, they are vulnerable to the damaging effect brought about by the rapids. So, disaster is going to happen soon. The only way out from that situation is to defy the risk of getting drowned. The question is, do they have the capacity to do so? Otherwise, these kids will be carried by those coffin dancers from Ghana. Alright, let's move on. To give you a profound explanation, let's go back to the key terms. Vulnerability is simply means susceptibility to damaging effects of a hazard. And capacity is the combination of strength, attributes, and resources available. And hazard means dangerous condition. The product of the combination of 3 elements that were discussed, hazard, vulnerability, and capacity, is what we call disaster risk, or simply risk. It is given with a formula. Disaster risk is equal to hazard times vulnerability over capacity. It implies that if we increase our capacity as people by arming ourselves with the knowledge, skills, and the attitude towards safety and resilience, disaster risk will eventually be reduced to an acceptable level. Speaking of disaster risk, we need to identify the factors that can aggravate or lessen the risk. Hazards will always be present. Therefore, disaster reduction strategies primarily include vulnerability and risk assessment. The following are some factors that can affect the vulnerability of a community. Political factors. First, a community's vulnerability can be linked to political will and commitment to developmental concerns. And second, lack of access to basic social services and information can increase vulnerability. Economic factors. First, poverty has the single most important influence to vulnerability. Second, economic status also relates to the capacity of a community to cope and recover from adverse effects. And the third, poverty eradication and creation of sustainable livelihoods are essential part of disaster risk reduction. Physical factors. First, access to suitable land, proper housing design, building materials, and accessibility of emergency services. Second, poor physical environment exposes people to hazards such as landslides, floods, fires, wind, disease, and epidemics. Social factors. First, level of education, training, safety and security, information and awareness, cultural beliefs, traditional values contribute to social well-being. Second, lack of awareness and access to information can result in increase of vulnerability. And lastly, environmental factors. The scarcity of resources in a community can reduce the coping solution and recovery from a disaster. Now let's have the comparison between vulnerabilities and capacities. First, we have to talk about the physical aspect. Elements involved, we have infrastructure. Vulnerability issue, we have substandard construction and design of buildings, roads, and bridges. To reduce the vulnerability and, of course, increase the capacity, hazard proofing is the answer. Second, environmental aspect. Element involved, we have forest lands. Vulnerability issue, we have deforested areas that can cause erosion. Reforestation and maintain a sustainable ecological system is the answer to this particular issue. The third one is social factor, the knowledge and awareness of people. The vulnerability issue here is the lack of education and awareness. And secondly, beliefs that can cause harm and induce vulnerability. The answer is adequate understanding of and training of DRRM. Another element under social aspect is organization. Vulnerability issue is all about the community in conflict because of race, religious belief, or political affiliation. To solve this particular concern, community members should set aside those differences and be united and organized into DRRM teams and volunteer groups. And lastly, we have economic aspect. We have two elements involved. We have family income. Second is livelihood. First, we have family income. The vulnerability issue is low-income families. To reduce the vulnerability and increase their capacity is simply by living below their means and save for the rainy days. Secondly, and lastly, livelihood. Vulnerability issue, the source of livelihood is highly susceptible to hazards such as fishing, which is disrupted when there is storm. To solve this particular problem on vulnerability, the source of livelihood with low susceptibility to environmental changes and hazards, so meaning they have to migrate from highly susceptible area to more stable or safer place to work with. To sum up, disaster risk reduction is a concept and practice of systematically studying the causes of disasters, reducing exposure to hazards, lessening the vulnerability of people and property, and lastly, improving the preparedness of people and communities to face hazards. Thus, DRR aims to strengthen the resilience of persons, communities,